When most people think about World War II, they picture armies clashing, cities burning, and empires crumbling. But there was another war happening in the shadows. A financial war fought not with bullets, but with the most precious metal on Earth. Gold worth billions in today's money simply disappeared into the darkness, and much of it has never been found. This is not just a story about missing treasure. This is about how entire nations' wealth can vanish overnight when the world descends into chaos. And the lessons from this massive heist are more relevant today than you might think. Let me paint you a picture of what we're dealing with here. In 1939, as Europe teetered on the brink of war, central banks across the continent held thousands of tons of gold. These weren't just shiny bars sitting in vaults for decoration. This gold was the backbone of entire monetary systems. It backed currencies, guaranteed government promises, and represented the accumulated wealth of nations. When the shooting started, this metal became the most valuable target on the planet. Not because it was pretty, but because whoever controlled it could finance armies, buy weapons, and ultimately determine who would win and who would lose. The scale of what happened next defies imagination. As Nazi forces swept across Europe, they weren't just conquering territory. They were systematically looting the gold reserves of every nation they overran. But this wasn't random pillaging by desperate soldiers. This was organized, methodical theft on an industrial scale. The Germans had detailed plans for seizing financial assets, and they executed those plans with ruthless precision. Belgium alone lost nearly 200 tons of gold that had been supposedly moved to safety in France. When France fell, that gold didn't just disappear into some forgotten warehouse. It was deliberately shipped to Nazi Germany to fund their war machine. Here's where the story gets truly disturbing. The theft wasn't just about nations stealing from other nations. This was personal wealth being stripped from millions of individuals. Jewish families, political dissidents, and anyone deemed undesirable by the regime had their gold confiscated before being shipped to concentration camps. Wedding rings, family heirlooms, dental fillings, nothing was too small to be seized. The Nazis melted it all down, recast it into standard bars, and laundered it through neutral banks as if it were legitimate government reserves. But Germany wasn't the only player in this game. On the other side of the world, Japanese forces were conducting their own massive looting operation across Asia. In China, Southeast Asia, and the Philippines, they seized gold, silver, and precious artifacts in what intelligence reports later called the Golden Lily Operation. Unlike the Germans, who moved their stolen wealth through established banking channels, the Japanese took a different approach. They buried massive quantities of treasure in hidden vaults and tunnel systems, planning to retrieve it after their expected victory. When defeat came instead, much of this hidden wealth was never recovered. The really shocking part is what happened to the countries that tried to protect their gold by moving it to safety. Take the Netherlands, which quietly shipped over 100 tons of gold to Britain, Canada, and the United States before the German invasion. Smart move, right? Except that even in supposedly safe locations, gold had a way of disappearing into bureaucratic black holes. Records were lost, shipments were misdirected, and accountability became nearly impossible in the chaos of global war. Poland provides one of the most dramatic examples of how desperate nations became to save their wealth. As German forces approached Warsaw, Polish officials executed a daring evacuation of their gold reserves. They moved the treasure across Romania, through Turkey, and eventually to North America in a journey that reads like an adventure novel. Yet even this heroic effort couldn't save all of Poland's wealth. Large quantities fell into Nazi hands and vanished into the same laundering networks that were processing stolen gold from across occupied Europe. The neutral countries played a particularly ugly role in this story. Switzerland, Sweden, Portugal, and Turkey all maintained their neutrality by being willing to do business with anyone who had gold to trade. Swiss banks in particular became the preferred destination for Nazi gold because they asked no questions about where it came from. They charged hefty fees for their discretion and helped transform stolen wealth into legitimate financial instruments that could be used to buy war supplies from other neutral nations. This wasn't accidental ignorance. Bank officials knew they were handling looted gold, but the profits were too enormous to resist. As Allied forces began pushing back in 1944 and 1945, both German and Japanese authorities faced a critical decision about what to do with their stolen wealth. Some of it was spent in desperate last-ditch efforts to buy more weapons and supplies. but enormous quantities were simply hidden, buried, or transferred to secret accounts that only a handful of people knew about. When those people died in the final battles of the war, the locations of vast treasure hoards died with them. The American military discovered some of these caches as they advanced through Germany. The most famous find was in the Merkers salt mine, where soldiers uncovered over 100 tons of gold bars, alongside priceless artworks and currency from across Europe. But this spectacular discovery represented only a tiny fraction of what had been stolen. Intelligence estimates suggested that thousands of tons of gold remained unaccounted for as the war ended. This brings us to the really troubling question: if so much gold went missing during the war, where did it end up after 1945? The answer is both simpler and more disturbing than most people realize. Much of it was absorbed into the very institutions that were supposed to be restoring order to the post-war world. When the guns fell silent in 1945, the victorious Allies faced a massive logistical nightmare. Millions of displaced people, destroyed infrastructure, collapsed governments, and somewhere in the chaos, thousands of tons of gold that nobody could properly account for. The temptation to simply look the other way was overwhelming. The Allies established something called the Tripartite Gold Commission in 1946, supposedly to return stolen gold to its rightful owners. Sounds noble, right? Over the next several decades, this commission managed to redistribute about 336 tons of recovered gold. But here's the problem with that number. Intelligence estimates suggested that the Nazis alone had stolen well over 1,000 tons during the war. The Japanese looting in Asia added hundreds more tons to the missing total. So where was the rest? The official answer was that it had been destroyed, lost, or was simply impossible to trace. The unofficial answer was much darker. What really happened was that the chaos of post-war reconstruction provided perfect cover for the largest money laundering operation in history. Gold that had been stolen from occupied countries was quietly integrated into the reserves of allied nations. Bars that had been melted down from Jewish wedding rings found their way into the vaults of central banks that asked no questions about provenance. The reasoning was always the same. Europe needed to be rebuilt, the Cold War was beginning, and asking too many questions about where the gold came from would only complicate an already impossible situation. Switzerland provides the perfect case study of how this worked. Swiss banks had accepted hundreds of millions of dollars worth of Nazi gold during the war, charging hefty commissions for their discretion. When the war ended, they simply continued business as usual. It wasn't until the 1990s that international pressure finally forced Swiss authorities to admit what everyone already knew. Their banks had knowingly laundered massive quantities of stolen gold and had spent 50 years covering it up. Even then, the amounts they acknowledged represented only a fraction of what had actually passed through their system. But the Swiss weren't unique. Portugal, Spain, Sweden, and Turkey had all served as intermediaries for wartime gold trafficking. When peace came, they had no incentive to admit their role in legitimizing stolen wealth. The gold in their vaults had become part of their national reserves, backing their currencies and supporting their post-war economic recovery. Admitting it was stolen would have meant giving it back, something no government was willing to do voluntarily. The story gets even murkier when you consider how the emerging intelligence agencies of the Cold War era operated. The CIA, British MI6, and other Western intelligence services needed untraceable funding for covert operations against communist expansion. What better source than gold that officially didn't exist? Allegations persist that some of the missing Nazi gold was repurposed into secret slush funds used to influence elections, support anti-communist movements, and topple unfriendly governments across Europe and Asia. The beauty of using stolen gold for these operations was that there were no official records to trace if things went wrong. The Japanese treasure presents an even more fascinating mystery. Unlike the Germans, who moved their stolen wealth through established banking channels, the Japanese buried massive quantities in the Philippines and other occupied territories. Local legends speak of entire cave systems filled with gold bars, precious stones, and ancient artifacts. Treasure hunters have been searching for these hoards ever since, and occasionally they actually find something. But the really significant discoveries have a way of disappearing into official secrecy before the public ever hears about them. Here's what makes this story relevant to your life today. The techniques perfected during World War II for moving, hiding, and laundering vast quantities of wealth haven't disappeared. They've just been updated for the digital age. When governments face financial crises, when currencies collapse, when political systems break down, wealth doesn't just evaporate. It gets transferred to those who understand how to make it disappear and reappear where they want it. The missing gold of World War II proved that in times of chaos, the normal rules of ownership become meaningless. What matters is who has physical control and who has the power to legitimize that control after the crisis passes. Today, instead of gold bars hidden in salt mines, we have digital currencies stored in encrypted wallets, offshore accounts in jurisdictions that don't cooperate with international investigators, and shell companies layered so deep that ownership becomes impossible to trace. The lesson isn't that you should start hoarding gold bars in your basement. The lesson is that when the world turns upside down, wealth flows to those who are prepared and ruthless enough to take advantage of the chaos. The vanishing gold of World War II isn't just ancient history gathering dust in some academic journal. It's a masterclass in how wealth disappears when civilization breaks down. The techniques used to steal, launder, and hide thousands of tons of precious metal didn't die with the Third Reich. They evolved, adapted, and became the blueprint for every major financial crime since then. Think about it. When governments tell you your assets are safe, when banks promise your deposits are protected, when international institutions claim they're watching out for your interests, remember this story. Remember that in 6 short years, the accumulated wealth of entire nations simply vanished into thin air. Not destroyed, not lost, but transferred to those who knew how to work the system when the rules stopped applying. The gold is still out there somewhere. Some of it sits in central bank vaults with paperwork that conveniently forgets to mention where it came from. Some of it funded decades of covert operations that reshaped the world in ways we're still discovering. And some of it remains buried in caves and tunnels, waiting for someone smart enough or lucky enough to find it. But here's the real treasure from this story. Understanding that when the world goes mad, the only protection you have is knowledge. Knowledge of how these systems really work, how wealth really moves, and how quickly everything you think is secure can disappear. The missing gold of World War II is proof that nothing, absolutely nothing, is too big to steal when the right people decide the time has come. If this opened your eyes to how the game is really played, hit subscribe. History has the answers, and we're just getting started.